When we think of historical first, we tend to think of the good stuff, the first man in space or the first man on moon. But there are a whole other, darker set of first, unique instances of death, insanity, torture and murder that inspired disturbing trends. Here are 10 of them. Number 10. First school shooting. On June 20, 1913, an unemployed 29-year-old named Jacob Schmidt walked onto a school in Bremen, Germany, and killed 4 girls. A fifth died breaking her neck as she tried to escape. They were all between the ages of 5 and 6. Several adults who tried to stop Schmidt suffered serious injuries, before a passing coachman entered the building with a pitchfork and beat him into submission. A true motive for the massacre was never established. As he was led away to a mental asylum, Schmidt was heard to cry, "This may be the beginning, but the end is yet to come." Number 9. First concentration camp. In 1896, colonial Spain had a problem. Armed guerrillas were fighting to wrest Cuba from Spanish control and hand it over to the people. Fearing the loss of their island, Spain dispatched General Butcher Weyler. Reasoning he had no way of knowing who were ordinary Cubans and who were fighters, Weyler decided to lock the entire population up in a little something he called reconcentration camps. Badly maintained, lacking shelter, and almost entirely without food, the camps soon turned into mass graves. Starvation racked the inmates. Disease swept through camp after camp. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children died. Those who refused to be interred were executed on the spot. All told, 400,000 civilians are thought to have died in what's known as the Cuban Holocaust. Number 8. First airstrike. In 1911, the concept of aerial warfare was still science fiction on November 1st. On that day, Italian airman Cavalli threw 4 bombs over the side of his plane and onto Turkish-held Tripoli. The next few weeks saw a campaign of semi-target airstrikes across the city. Air bases had grenades dropped down on them. Turkish positions were pummeled. A field hospital was accidentally bombed, triggering international outrage. A short 30 years later, the same principle would be used to flatten first London, then Pearl Harbor, then finally major cities in Germany and Japan. Number 7. First modern terrorist campaign. The roots of terrorism can be traced back to the 1st century BC, but it wasn't until the 1880s that a group of angry dissidents decided to start randomly targeting civilians. Known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood, they responded to British crimes in their home with a dynamite campaign that targeted the London Underground. On October 30th, 1883, 2 bombs exploded on the Metropolitan Railway line. One went off early and only succeeded in damaging the tunnel. The other scored a direct hit on a passing carriage. 4 people were badly injured, with a further 24 suffering minor injuries. It was the beginning of a terror campaign that would injure upwards of 80 people. Number 6. First Death March. We tend to associate death marches with German and Japanese brutality in World War II. But their history has its roots a little closer to home. The first modern death march was conducted by American soldiers. The year was 1838. The U.S. government had been quietly removing Native American tribes from the East for the best part of the decade. Often, these removals had resulted in their own fatal journeys. Yet it was the Cherokees under the watchful eye of General Scott who would experience the first modern death march. At gunpoint, Scott forced tens of thousands of Cherokees to march for 1,200 miles into their new territory. Bad weather, starvation, and disease killed thousands on the way. It's estimated today that 5,000 died on this march, murdered by a callous government. Those that survived found themselves many miles from home, with few belongings and little hope for the future. It was a brutal policy, but one that would be used against Native Americans time and again for decades to come. Number 5. First Modern Revolution. The first revolution in history more than likely occurred at a time when we were all living in huts and had names like Yug and Gug. The first modern revolution, on the other hand, we can trace to a specific date. Specifically, 1688, the year of Britain's Glorious Revolution. According to UK historian Ed Valence, this revolution can be classified as modern not just because of the insane levels of violence that accompanied it, but also because of the culture clash behind it. Valence argues that all prior revolutions were about progressive modernizers clashing with traditionalists. Starting with 1688, they typically became about two groups of progressives clashing with each other, culminating, usually violently, in the profound transformation of the state. In other words, it was the first time two groups wanted to change society so drastically that one had to dispose of the other to do it. Number 4. First biological weapon. In 1347, Mongol forces were busy occupying themselves by laying siege to the strategically important port of Kaffa in modern Ukraine. Looking for new ways of harming the inhabitants, an unknown general ordered his men to place plague-infested bodies in the catapult and fire them into the city. Not only was this the first recorded incident of germ warfare in history, it may have indirectly shaped the modern world. According to the source, a number of traders at Kaffa hailed from Italy. There's a good chance that these same traders quickly escaped home when they saw the plague sweeping through the besieged port, resulting in the Black Death reaching Europe. As we know, the plague then consumed the continent, killing as many as 25 million people and changing the course of history. Number 3. First chemical warfare. Although it is most associated with World War I, chemical warfare still seems like a modern aberration, the sort of thing our ancestors would have considered with horror. So it can come as something of a surprise to learn we have scientific evidence of it being used as early as 256 AD. In 2009, scientists uncovered evidence of bitumen and sulfuric crystals at the remains of Dura Europos city in Syria. The evidence was found at the exact spot where 20 asphyxiated Roman bodies were uncovered in 1930, painting a terrible picture of some forgotten battle. It's now theorized that Persian invaders facing the Roman soldiers in siege tunnels under the city burned the crystals and used bellows to blast the toxic air into their enemies' faces, causing unconsciousness in seconds and death in minutes. If true, it would be the earliest incident of chemical warfare for which we have evidence, some 1,800 years before the notorious battles at Ypres. Number 2. First genocide. Genocide reared its ugly head for the first time in recorded history during the Third Punic War. Fed up with the city-state of Carthage throwing its weight around, the Romans made the decision to utterly destroy it. And while the sacking of cities and murder of their inhabitants was not uncommon at the time, it was rarely this ferocious or so thought through. There's evidence that the Romans weren't interested in simply gaining a tactical advantage or doing away with enemies, but simply hated the Carthaginians so much that nothing less than their total destruction would suffice. To that end, they laid siege to the city, slaughtered its inhabitants or sold them into slavery, and then proceeded to dismantle it brick by brick, eventually burning the remains to the ground so only ash remained. Number 1. First gas chamber. Today we associate gas chambers with the horrors of the Holocaust. But the Nazis weren't the first to use this method to exterminate undesirables. That honor goes to the Turkish and Kurdish forces during the Armenian Genocide. In 1915, the Ottoman state set out to wipe every trace of the Armenians from the face of the earth. Villages were rounded up and executed. Others were sent on death marches into the blistering desert sun. Yet others were taken into the Syrian desert, where they became history's first victims of the gas chamber. On their captor order, civilians were herded into a large cave. The Turkish forces then pumped the cave full of smoke until everyone inside was dead from asphyxiation. It's estimated that thousands died in this manner.